Welcome back, Estelden here. Role-playing games have had their little resurgence with Disco Elysium and the Outer Worlds being released so close together and filling the void finally that has been left by the embarrassments of Anthem and Fallout 76, which saw the so-called RPG pioneers just chasing the money and falling flat on their faces. People seemed happy, ignoring the epic store debacle with Worlds. It was relatively well received, and even though the fairy tale might be over with Obsidian's move to Microsoft now, we'll have to wait and see on that, it seemed like it was worth the wait. Was it though? Well, let's get into it. So the Outer Worlds is a hub-based game which seemed to take inspiration from Knights of the Old Republic and similar games rather than the likes of New Vegas, the latter being what I think some people were expecting originally. Honestly, I'm glad it wasn't though, because even the smaller open areas of the Outer Worlds are actually pretty dull. The combat is dull, and I did find that when I tried to strategize on even regular difficulties, I realized I was completely wasting my time because the combat and AI is just far too brain dead to really need to bother. Perhaps on the harder difficulties there's a bit more to it, but I just didn't see enough that really impresses me enough to even bother going through the same stuff on a more difficult mode. Where the game did shine though is the number of settlements and fleshed out towns. Now some of the quests were a little mixed, but the actual settlements gave me a ton of nostalgia back to the old Fallouts and even Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines at times, with just how nicely they were laid out and felt like proper towns. The problem with the rest of the game though is that none of the quests or characters in the Outer Worlds actually reached those heights ever again, and too much of the time I just felt like I was treading old ground. For instance, there's a quest where some guy disappears from town, and the clues lead you to a family's house where it's obvious that something is going on, and the residents start getting really vague about what's actually happening here and what's happened to this missing person. The whole time I was thinking, please, not another cannibal story. I'm certain I remember that from Fallout 3, a game that was mostly considered inferior to New Vegas, but now the so-called experts were flat out ripping it off. It turns out that they were cannibals, and there was nothing more interesting going on at all. This is the case for far too many quests in the game. You have these hopes where something exciting might be just around the corner, but it ends up being a real safe, cookie-cutter quest with barely anything memorable about it. I think it's clear that whoever was calling the shots on this game wanted to produce a really safe, by-the-numbers game that they thought would appease the Mass Effect and Fallout crowd without going in the wrong direction. But it's silly. Original Fallout took a massive risk by going for a post-apocalyptic sci-fi setting instead of the typical sword and sorcery, which was the staple and the only thing to do for a long time in role-playing games. Just look at Baldur's Gate, a far more successful game than original Fallout commercially, for example. Making a classic RPG means thinking about how to take things forward, not trying to rip off Fallout 3 and mashing it in with Borderlands. On that note, there is just far too much loot scattered around everywhere. Sure, I'm sure there's some metric somewhere on all their spreadsheets that said players love looting stuff, but too much of it and it just starts becoming an utter chore, instead of looting feeling like you've discovered hidden goodies. Every second crate seems to contain a large amount of bullets, and it honestly interferes with the setting, which seems to play itself off like the world isn't quite thriving. I mean, there's people in some of these towns with barely anything who seem poor. All they need to do is wander down the damn street and they'll find a year's worth of crap to actually sell. I just don't think there was a purpose here. There was no vision from the start about what sort of game they were going to make and how the Outer Worlds was going to be a great game. It seems like they got out some old Fallout and Mass Effect scrapbooks, picked and chose what the metrics had told them was the most popular features from both games, and they put a bingo card together and put it in some sort of game design simulator. What we're left with is a game that's a jack of all trades and just doesn't master anything. There are choices in this game to be made, but it's hard to care at all about the opposing sides in these conflicts. I also don't like how the Outer Worlds goes about getting you involved in these conflicts. The way it works is you'll go to each town, you'll meet the leader and he'll talk to you non-stop about his ideals, his beliefs, but he'll never actually show you. You're rarely caught in the middle of things to actually help build investments in the decisions that you're going to make later on. It seems like these leaders just tell you their thoughts and you pick what you like better from what they say. But why? Are none of these people actually liars? Do they not act differently than they talk, perhaps? Original Fallout did this much better. If you take original Fallout, in a town called Junktown, the first thing that happens when you enter this town is there's a bloody gunfight which makes the intentions of both sides really clear. You don't go and speak to both of them at your own accord, you're caught front and center in the middle, and it raises the stakes. The art style's a bit off too. I don't normally care about the graphic quality of a game as long as it's really good, but the art at times it feels really lazy and ugly. It seems like they put some pretty boring areas together and went to work on selecting the most obscure colour combinations they could in Paint, applying them and then calling it a day. These do not feel like alien planets. They feel like some school kid in the library put some random colour combinations together and called them art. There's nothing distinct about them, and frankly New Vegas felt more believable as an alien planet despite that being Earth. New Vegas had a more subtle approach to weirdness, and the factions actually had more fleshed out stories, while the different sides of Stellar Bay just felt useless. So that's enough bashing the Outer Worlds for now, because at the end of the day I still enjoyed it more than the vast majority of modern games. There were no microtransactions in this game. For the most part it was a finished product. I didn't feel the need to wait for patches or apology updates from the developers who then bang on about wanting to create a polished and living world. There was no need for that nonsense because we actually got what was advertised. And at the end of the day, what was advertised was an RPG which was close in style to Obsidian's other efforts, and that is what we got. I've seen a lot of people praising this game though, like it's a Game of the Year contender, and I just can't agree. I really think that the last couple of years of bad games in the RPG genre, or at least from RPG developers originally, has lowered people's standards of what's actually a good game. When you play Mass Effect Andromeda and Fallout 76 and then transition over to the Outer Worlds, then sure, it feels spectacular. But if I go back and play New Vegas or even Mass Effect 1, and then this one just feels like plastic. Like they sat around trying to think of zany things and quirky characters instead of just designing a world that felt real and lifelike. The trouble is that safe has become a word that feels exciting to people these days, and it's not really their fault. When we hear about innovation and change, sadly it always means live service, a new monetization scheme involving free-to-play or a series chasing the trends of other popular games. When people hear that a game is just going to be a standard RPG, it's suddenly a cause for celebration because we feel lucky to even be getting that at all. I feel that's the reason the Outer Worlds was the way it is, because they felt like they'd lose nothing by releasing something pretty standard, it doesn't shock anyone or feel memorable, by just getting that out the door and getting it right, which to be fair, I mean it did. It's certainly not a bad game. It stands on its own because it's got no competition really. I mean sure, Disco Elysium, the cop RPG, released really close to it, but that's a game that actually did innovate. It felt like a Planescape Torment, but with its own little spin. That of course came from an indie studio with a clear direction in mind, while the Outer Worlds came from 2K Games essentially, who might have had some say in the game's direction. The way forward is really going to have to come from the indie studios. I think a lot of RPG fans really don't care about the graphics, and I mean you go back to Morrowind, and even by the standards of 2003, the animations were pretty stiff and the dialogue was mostly text. I don't believe the game was a major success based on presentation quality, even though the music, the art direction and the graphics for the time were still pretty stellar given its scope. And I believe if a really ambitious indie studio looked at a game like Morrowind, looked to replicate what it did for RPG gaming by taking that next step forward, focused on the depth of the game world instead of graphics, then they could pull off something similar again, and I really think that would sell really, really well and get a lot of people excited. Combat is certainly an area that RPGs have started to have a bit of trouble with. With the mainstream success of Witcher 3, it's now going to be very hard for an RPG to have any sort of tactical combat outside indies. Divinity Original Sin is the exception to that, but it's a game that's exceptional in most departments, and most people who are new to turn-based RPGs would just associate that with Larian, thinking that's kind of their style, instead of that being something that RPGs used to be, and that was pretty common. The Outer Worlds really phones in the gunplay in that aspect. It doesn't feel tactical at all, and more like something that was included to keep the RPG aspect optional for people who just want to go out and shoot things. If we take a look at the RPGs now doing the rounds, potentially in 2020 and beyond, the heavy hitters are of course Cyberpunk, and to a much lesser extent Bloodlines 2, followed by the likes of Wasteland 3 and personal favourite potentially, Elix 2. I think we're pretty safe with Cyberpunk. I think it'll be a mix of Witcher 3 and Deus Ex, probably a little bit of GTA thrown in now that CD Projekt Red are a lot more mainstream. I think they know the expectations on that game, and in the mainstream's eyes, its success will pretty much cement them as the RPG studio most in its prime now that Bethesda and BioWare have completely fallen off the deep end. Now, I don't think every single RPG needs to innovate and break new ground, but you just need to look at franchise growth for some of the best games out there. If we take Fallout 3 to then Fallout New Vegas, there was a ton more depth in that latter game, Far more quests, far more factions, and it just felt like a game that really learned and built on top of the things in 3 that needed improving. I mean, I know that was a different developer, but even if you look at Fallout 4, it felt like a shinier version of 3 with most elements watered down. The new features were things no one was asking for, and Outer Worlds feels a little bit like that too. I mean, it's certainly shinier, but where's the depth? That's the lacking area that these series just never seem to want to grow in. The other problem RPGs seem to be facing is a loss of a sense of identity. So many games nowadays, whether it be Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Tomb Raider, they've all started introducing these RPG elements because some metric somewhere told the big bosses that that'll get people in the door. Instead of genres trying to excel on their own, they try and match themselves together to draw in multiple audiences, even though it usually ends up just disappointing both sides. Problem here is it really stagnates the growth for most people looking to find a new RPG. I know for myself, when I played Divinity Original Sin, I loved it so much that the first thing I did when I finished was actually look up games that were a bit like it. It introduced me to a wealth of old games I hadn't played before, and it really opened my eyes to what RPGs could actually be. It's the same for many people with Fallout New Vegas. They played Fallout 3 and probably enjoyed it, but then New Vegas is the sort of game that people have played for thousands of hours over multiple playthroughs. And a lot of people actually crave that experience again, but in a new way. They aren't going to get that with the Outer Worlds, which is a real big shame. And the issue with that is that when people are now being introduced to these watered down versions of RPGs like Assassin's Creed Odyssey is, or any other game that throws in a few RPG elements like picking stats and things like that, when newcomers find those games, they're going to assume that's what a role-playing game is, and if it doesn't grab them, they probably aren't going to seek out others, real RPGs, and they're certainly not going to look at indie titles, in which there are some excellent ones in the RPG genre right now. There needs to be a push in the right direction for role-playing games, and it needs to come from the studios that are starting to do great things. I'm sorry to say it, but the old studios like Obsidian, BioWare, they're like aging rock bands putting out a reunion album at this point. Their games are simply not as good as their older ones, and any attempts at a revival are always just safe and like they're just doing the bare minimum that's needed when it comes to creativity. The new studios, the ones who are establishing themselves, are the ones that are going to turn heads going forward. There are a lot of murmurings about the new Wizards of the Coast studio being completely hands-off from the company managers, and creativity is apparently rampant. But we'll have to wait and see, and the same goes for a game like Baldur's Gate 3, which I'm quietly excited about because Larian hasn't really failed us yet. Fallout New Vegas will be 10 years old this year, and it's a call for celebration. I could see it getting a re-release of some sort, perhaps on the Switch or new consoles, which will probably please some people who only have an old PS3 to play it on or something like that. But then I think of the Outer Worlds. In 2029, that game will be 10 years old. And I'd be very surprised if anyone remembers it at all, let alone is celebrating it. Not a bad game, just a forgettable one. Thanks guys, and I'll see you again.